Brett, you should sit here.
He has better perspective.
Ah, okay.
I would like to, I'm going to make a short introduction to the discussion of the panelists and later on the roundtable discussion that will take place today. First of all, I would like to thank the Stanford Humanities Lab group of faculty and directors that are here today. And also I would like to thank SCI-Arc for the help in the contributions from the administration to the staff to work and to prepare this event. This event is mostly an introduction to a collaboration that will take place between SCI-Arc and Stanford. So this is the first event or the first step, let's say, toward the possibility of a collaboration. We've been working with them in various projects for the last year. I would like to, Jeffrey later on will do a larger or more extensive introduction on regard to what is the Stanford Humanities Lab. The only thing that I would like to mention right now is that what interested us from the Humanities Lab is that even though that is outside, it's a laboratory that is outside of the discipline, or it's not, it's outside of the discipline of architecture, is ingrained within the humanities, but it's trying to open a new door within scholarly studies, where the base of the research is not only defined within the academic environment, but it's trying to extend outside of the academic environment again. So I think that the relationship, already in the name of the Stanford Humanities Lab, the Humanities and Lab, presents an idea of what is the intention at stake. Working with scholarly research and at the same time using experimentation and innovation in a way where in other departments at Stanford is already happening. The three elements that I would like to introduce before we start the discussion to kind of present or frame some of the ideas that we've been already discussing are three topics. One is design, the other one is collaboration, and the third one is education, which are also part of the title of this symposium. Through this year, we've been discussing with them the notion of design. What is at the core of the idea of design? And being SCI-Arc already School of Design, which deals with that as a basic information, let's say, I think that what is interesting to see in the Stanford Humanities Lab is that the notion of design is one that is expanded, which is not based on the specifics of the object or the specific research on object-based design as we define it in schools of architecture, for example, but it's one that has to do with knowledge. One has to do with methodology. So it's not so much about the way in which you do things, but how you think through knowledge or through research and work. So it's an expanded notion of design that I think is interesting to address. The idea of collaboration. One of the main things that I think was interesting by visiting a lot Stanford was that you start to revisit the idea of collaboration. Much have been talked about multidisciplinary teams or collaborative efforts, but I think that a revision of collaborative work is something that is quite interesting to see within an academic environment like SCI-Arc. And I think that, in the two examples that I'm showing in these two slides, you have an idea of what it would be a kind of research collaborative effort, or the work within designers that in general is more defined from subjects, from personalities to personalities, from designers to artists or thinkers. And the network is defined by this kind of point-to-point connection. Instead of being more of a close collaborative effort, like in the left, this is some images from IDEO at Palo Alto, where research happens through discussion, or it happens constantly through multidisciplinary groups that come together. I think that from either or of those two models are like present models at the moment, but those are two models that through an academic environment, it could be evolved into an expanded notion of collaboration, where the basis of the work that it happens with architecture, within the architecture discipline, could be expanded to one that is either being active now in different industries or in other environments like Stanford. To finish and to close with the idea of education, we were having the discussion the other day with Chris, and we come up with a notion of like, the truth is that a model of education is already existent, or it's a model that, education through collaboration is a model that is, to say, it's not new. It's something that it has been developed in different institutions. So just to use as an example the Bauhaus, and how that model of collaboration worked at that moment, in which the different, was mostly defined through the arts and fabrication and the work of, from architecture to the arts, the shift from the architecture to the art. But what I found interesting was that their methodology moves, these are 3 diagrams that are showing the kind of academic, the definition by the school, depending on each one of the directors, from Gropius to Meyer to Mies van der Rohe. And each one of them shows kind of the big idea of how the school will start to deal, mainly the Bauhaus, will start to deal with this notion of the arts and the collaboration between the arts, being centralized in architecture, being multidisciplinary and working within other areas, or being more descriptive to really specific areas, as if they were isolated in the last part. So I think that I find interesting this kind of academic chart, or this academic definition that starts to find points of connections, and at the same time starts to define a model, here by means of a diagram, but starts to define a model of what it could be the right combination from the elements of the different collaboration, from the different disciplines, or from the different studies. So I think that one of the main ideas for starting with this partnership, or again collaboration with Humanities Lab, is to start to rethink those notions, and through design a new model of education and a collaborative model, or that expands traditional notions, or that expands some of the elements that are taking place at the moment. I think that's one of the things that we intend to develop. And the discussion today is not a closed discussion. It's mainly a discussion that will try to open the door to these issues. And again, this is the first presentation by the groups. I would like to introduce Michael Speaks. Michael Speaks, of course, is a fundamental part of this project, and we've both been exchanging with Stanford throughout this last year. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you all for coming. I should just point out that Florencia has done an enormous amount of organization and work to put this thing together, and we all owe, I think, her a debt of gratitude. It was really a lot of work for her to get all this stuff together. The idea for the format for tonight is that we'll have presentations from SCI-Arc, from Stanford Humanities Lab. We'll also have presentations by SCI-Arc. Each of the presentations will be approximately 10 minutes. That is about 30 minutes for Stanford Humanities Lab, and about 30 minutes for faculty members at SCI-Arc. After that, we'll be joined in a panel discussion by SCI-Arc, some SCI-Arc faculty members, some faculty members from Stanford, and also a special guest, Brett Steele from the AA, who's going to join us in a panel discussion at the end. So just I'm going to introduce everybody on the panel first, and then we can kind of get on with it. The idea for the presentations and for the discussion, hopefully, is that it's open-ended and it's a real discussion where Stanford can present the kind of collaborative models of design, education, and research they're working on, and where SCI-Arc can do the same. The three presenters from Stanford are all directors of the Stanford Humanities Lab. I'm going to just read this to get this right. Jeffrey Schnapp, who is a director of SHL, he's a professor of French and Italian and comparative literature. Jeffrey, I think, is going to tell us a little bit about the project of Stanford Humanities Lab, what it's up to, and where it goes, and maybe even how it interfaces with what we're up to. Michael Shanks will present next. He's also a director of Stanford Humanities Lab. He's a professor of classics, cultural and social anthropology, and I think he's probably going to talk about a project that they're working on now with Daimler Chrysler. And last will be Henry Lowen, who's, as I said, a director of SHL. He's a curator of history of science and technology and the German collection, and I believe he's going to present some of the work he's been doing on gaming. So those three will present, and then we'll quickly have presentations by Hernan Diaz Alonso, a faculty member here at SCI-Arc, Wes Jones, faculty member, and the director of the school, Eric Moss. Immediately after that, we'll be joined by as I said, by the panel, and we'll have a discussion about the presentations, and also just generally about design education, where it is today, where this school is, where Stanford is, and where it goes from here. So I'll turn it over to Jeffrey Schnapp. Thank you guys for coming. We're really thrilled that you're here, and we're excited about the discussion about what happens afterwards. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael and Florencia, for your introductions, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And one of the points I want to start out with, in what will be just a very concise presentation that gives you about 5 or 6 minutes on what the Stanford Humanities Lab is and what its ambitions are. And then an example of a project that was one of the founding projects of the lab. I think that is rather symptomatic and exemplary with respect to these sets of ambitions. But I should say, just from the outset, and I'll be really jumping through these slides pretty quickly, I'm not going to be commenting on them in any detail, but that what constantly struck me, and was certainly one of the sort of founding urges that led me to create this experiment that's called the Stanford Humanities Lab, was really just this sense that there was a sort of perpetual conversation about interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity, collaboration, teamwork, and so forth within the great research universities in the United States. And everybody waves those banners rather enthusiastically until you ask them to change their disciplinary practices. And then suddenly, the enthusiasm wanes. So I thought it would be an interesting experiment to create a structure that is an incubator precisely for forms of disciplinary practice. In other words, not just a theoretical space of transdisciplinarity, but an actual practical space that is project-based, that is a hands-on space, where, in a sense, research questions, where content drives, if you like, the construction of alternative models, innovative models that go beyond a kind of print-based concept of what knowledge is, which is the dominant model within most of the disciplines that make up the humanities, and certainly many of the disciplines that make up the social sciences. But also one that thinks radically and innovatively about the prospects for enhanced models of education that involve certainly what one would have to describe as either the hands-on or the applied dimension to research, a dimension that's rarely present in institutions of higher learning, but it's very typical of schools of architecture, interestingly enough. So in a sense, this conversation got going, I think, in part because of a convergence that's happening. From our side of things, the very notion of a humanities lab is an oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms, and that contradiction is exactly the kind of space that me and my colleagues aspired to open up in creating a research center that is neither a media lab, nor a technology lab, nor a traditional humanities research center, nor a teaching support facility, but rather a kind of experimental location within major research universities that experiments with humanities-specific forms of collaboration. That's what the word lab stands for, at least in part, with experimentation with hands-on forms of training along the lines of scientific laboratories, and above all, experimentation with different future scenarios for what humanistic scholarship might mean that transcend the medium of print as the exclusive domain within which knowledge is communicated. And that range of meanings encompasses everything from actually building physical objects to software development, hardware development, a whole range of possible themes. The Humanities Lab has been in operation for 5 years right now. We're based in a digital media and experimental teaching facility with a top floor loft that looks a little bit like, we'd actually like it to look more like SCI-Arc than it does. It's something we struggle with. And it's both a conventional research center and a kind of distributed hub for a cluster of distributed projects that take place all over the place, all over the world, in fact. And that it hosts everything from, as I said, the building of physical artifacts to virtual artifacts, devices, tools, and the like. We are all of this and more, a group of people, largely, a site that's largely, whose research agendas are often powerfully shaped by the research interests and ambitions of the faculty and students who make up the community. What's different about us from a traditional humanities research center are a couple of things, and I'm only going to highlight a few of them here for purposes of this conversation. And it really is a conversation. It's the beginning of a conversation. We are project-based, much like an architecture school is. We don't, in other words, we fund, typically our projects are 3 to 7 year cycle projects. Sometimes we did a public art project that was a 1-year project. But typically they're projects that where we try to incubate them in an initial phase, and then we spin them off, we launch them, we try to find external funding for them. We serve as a kind of incubator. But unlike traditional humanities research centers, Henry and Michael and I and other faculty members, we have an interventionist stance vis-a-vis the projects that come to us. We don't just say, okay, we love your project, it's great, really interesting questions, here's some money, go out and do it. We actually participate in the design of the project at every phase of its development. Part of that has to do with bringing a kind of technological imagination to a conversation about what the most interesting way to undertake a project is. And there are many faculty who find this absolutely galling and who don't want to play. But I think many people find it an extraordinary departure from the traditional way of working, which is in the humanities, a solitary mode of production of knowledge, if you like. It's a craft-based model where students acquire this craft on a kind of one-to-one basis or in the classroom. And it's a mode of knowledge transmission that, as I have already hinted at, is very powerfully linked to the medium of print as the sole medium for the communication of valid or acceptable, recognizable scholarship. As part of the mix, design becomes a central feature, project design, knowledge design, the architecture of knowledge, a central feature of what we do in our interventions, in our brainstorming with project principal investigators. So design, indeed, in this expanded sense, as Florencia hinted, is very much a part of what we think about and do. There are a number of themes that are focal points for and Henry and Michael will touch upon some of them here. I just want to mention a few that might be of interest to this audience. The whole issue of archives in an era where methods of capture, whether it's video, audio, or whatever, are so ubiquitous that archives have increasingly become these monsters where the standard conservation practices, the standard practices of those who archive, namely libraries and archives, are largely based on a kind of, a universe of print where everything needs to be preserved, if you like. I mean, libraries know how to handle archives, they know how to process them, how to keep them for the long duration, and yet archives are increasingly becoming these sorts of monsters that, where the pure conservation model raises almost as many questions as it could possibly answer. We're interested in this whole issue of how one can bring archives out of the archive, so to speak, how to animate them, how to use information technology approaches that are not in the hands necessarily of librarians who are our friends, naturally, our allies, not our enemies, but to think outside of the box about what, for instance, the future of archives will be, and particularly as archives become increasingly multimedial in their nature. A number of our projects have to do with these issues. Social software, collaborative authoring tools, the possibility for using authoring tools that go beyond, that facilitate models of collaboration, often between inside and outside the walls of the academy. And we have a number of projects that have used these tools to get, for instance, communities of practitioners to write the pieces, to build up the pieces of their own history of a practice. Henry's work, maybe Henry will say something about this in relation to our games project. The issue of experience capture and enhancement in classrooms and museums. Interpretive databases, where the whole first wave of information technology work in the humanities, the work that really has mattered and has revolutionized humanities disciplines has been led by digital library projects, basically using the just sheer information retrieval powers of databases to transform the nature of disciplines. We're in a new phase right now where interpretive scholarship, which is really where the action is in most humanities disciplines, now needs to come to meet and interact with that kind of infrastructure, road building, old sort of first generation model of humanities scholarship. Scholarship in new media scholarship, another area. The multi-purposing of scholarship, the building of models that allow for forms of tradition, even rather traditional forms of knowledge, to speak to audiences that are not the increasingly small and fragmented audiences of scholarship in humanities fields. Curating physical space. We've been thinking a lot about the possibility that the notion of curating as a kind of mode by which scholars intervene in the world could be a model for extending through information technology devices the reach of scholarship out into places that are not the traditional places of culture or knowledge. Foresight research, a topic that I'll allow my colleague Bill Cocaine to mention in the panel discussion if he is so inclined. I could detail some of the projects that relate to these different areas of interest and activity. I'm going to skip over that section just to mention a couple of themes that are crucial to this model of humanistic research that the Humanities Lab has been experimenting with. And we really consider it an experiment without without pre-guessing what exactly its outcomes will be. We think of ourselves as an incubator for innovative approaches to the humanities that, of course, place at the center of their reflection, but not as the object of reflection necessarily, the potential for information technologies to play a central role in facilitating, enabling transdisciplinary research and team-based or collaborative or hands-on approaches to the humanities. And that notion is captured also by the notion of producing, not just studying knowledge. In other words, getting away from this concept that the humanities are a kind of craft that must be acquired through many years of study before one is allowed to step over the line into doing original research. Our projects are mostly students. 90% of the population of researchers are everything from freshmen to postdocs. And they do real work that is not stapling and copying and so forth. They are the researchers. They co-sign, just like in the sciences, the projects. They become the authors, so to speak. Big humanities. Big humanities is a provocation. It's meant as to suggest a model of humanities research on the analogy of big science. In other words, that puts together those little pieces of expert knowledge that have been the great fruit of the emergence of specializations and micro-specializations since the World War II period in the humanities disciplines, but that have also created increasingly insular small worlds of research that don't communicate among one another, not to mention across disciplines. We try to put those little pieces together into big things that matter, that are high visibility, that are high impact. That's what we mean by big humanities. Multiple outputs, multiple audiences. The challenge of building these projects around partnerships with public institutions, museums, industry, and the like, we find that a stimulating challenge, a challenge that forces us to speak multiple languages, if you like, to translate out of these expert languages into languages that are accessible to other disciplines. That's what this conversation is about as well. And finally, building links. I'm going to jump through here and take just the last minute or two to say something about...
Just maybe a minute or two.
Yeah, okay, maybe a minute or two. One example of a big humanities project, and that is the Crowds project, which is now close to complete. The design of the project, which took about 6 months to really come up with, was to link a very large-scale, multi-layered book called Crowds, a crowded book, which is the skeleton of which is a traditional multi-author humanistic book, except for the fact that the authors have communicated and worked together over the course of 5 years in producing the book, layered with work by students and a number of different strata, word histories of keywords in major languages that give a kind of micro-historical view of these macro-historical issues regarding how crowds, how multitudes have played a central role in different areas of life in the modern era. An exhibition, a public exhibition, a 4,000 square foot exhibition called Revolutionary Tides that's up now at the Cantor Center for the Arts on the Stanford campus. And we'll move to the Wolfsonian in the spring and summer of 2006. And a website that serves as a kind of bleed-over zone, a spillover zone between this print artifact, which could stand on its own, but has lots of contents that are only web-based, and an exhibition where there are contents from the website that are inside the exhibition on a series of devices that are of media stations, which we built, and I'm just going to go to my final slide here as a feature of the show, that are themselves reconstructions of a series of projects from the 1920s by the Russian constructivist Gustav Klutz's of media stations designed for the streets and squares of Moscow, which we have built into the exhibition. We've done the most accurate, as far as we know, reconstructions of these structures that have ever been done. They're 1/3 to 1/2 scale reconstructions, and that serve as supports, as multimedia devices within the context of the exhibition space. You can see how they function here. One of them is a radio kiosk, the second is a film kiosk, and the third is a World Wide Web kiosk. We've repurposed what was intended as a radio media station into a support device for the very website that serves as this kind of intermediary crossover zone between the book and the exhibition. I'll stop there.
Wow, thanks, Jeffrey. The show is a really amazing show. If anybody has a chance to get up to Stanford to see the show, it's a remarkable show. I've seen it twice, and I hope I get to see it again when it's next up. Next speaker is Mike Shanks. Michael, are you loaded? Are you ready to go?
Yeah, I just have to swap with Jeffrey.
We're gonna try. I mean, we hope that each of these would go about 10 minutes. So it's great that Jeffrey gave us a larger kind of overview of SHL and their ambitions and what they're up to. But we're gonna try, just for the purpose of keeping this a real discussion, to hold these things to about 10 minutes. So I will become a little more brutal with timekeeping from here on out. So Michael is loaded and ready to go.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do. I'm an archaeologist, but I think you're going to find that I don't quite do some of the things you imagine an archaeologist does. First of all, let me give you some context as to how I see archaeology, how we work in the kind of archaeology that I'm interested in. The context is a bunch of fields that some of which you're going to be familiar with, but which conventionally aren't associated with archaeology. First, there's material culture studies. I'll leave it at that. It's a kind of branch of anthropology, sociology, design history, and also the contemporary arts. I hope it'll become clear why I think it's relevant. But just to wrong foot you straight away, Some of the things that I get up to with colleagues and that I'm interested in include, for example, garbology, digging landfill sites. Garbage and the creativity of mess is one of the things that I find absolutely fascinating, not least because it is kind of ignored and we don't really particularly often like it, and we absolutely, totally misunderstand garbage. But anyway, I love it. It's glorious. A focus, a series of focal points in the kind of things I do. First of all, archaeology as broadly concerned with the history of people's relationships with things. People-thing relationships. But also, there's a reflexive moment to this archaeology. A reflexive moment meaning that archaeology is such a relationship that we have with things. And what's more, this relationship, this archaeological relationship with things, is part of the way we think today. It's part of the way we are today. It's not coincident that archaeology starts off in its modern guise in the 18th century. We just kind of don't realize that, well, I'm going to say this, aren't I? I'm an archaeologist. I'm going to tell you that you all have to be archaeologists. No, you all are archaeologists, even if you're a closet archaeologist. But a key point here in understanding why archaeology is relevant to the kind of things we're talking about is to a very basic premise. Archaeologists don't discover the past. Archaeologists work on what is left of the past. It's a very different thing. So some of the projects I get up to give you some context. I've looked at prehistoric monuments in Northern Europe, megaliths, chambered tombs, and such. But at the same time, I've also done, earlier on, a large project that looked at, I'm hesitating over this because, beer cans. So for a year, I studied the design of beer cans in Northern England and Sweden. I spent 10 years looking at ancient Corinthian perfume jars in the context of early Mediterranean urbanism. So urban experience in relationship to stuff. This is the design history that I'm talking about. A branch, a field, I don't know what you want to call it, subdiscipline, no. Something called theater archaeology. I'll give you a definition of that later. Hopefully it'll kind of emerge in what I'm saying here as to kind of what I mean by that. Several projects looking at place and space. Archaeologists are fascinated with the temporality of a site, of a place. Again, we all have this sensibility now, and that is the temporal depth or lack of it that any place or site, any feature, any structure has. It's about that relationship that place, space has with time. Landscape and place, but particularly through a field that is only recently receiving definition, and that is site-specific art, both installation art and as well as performance art and time-based media. Another project that you've already heard mention about is one we're running at the moment, looking at the future of mobile media in car interiors, with Daimler Chrysler as our industrial affiliate partner. And we also have another project going with 14 performance artists on presence and liveness and mediation. The artists include Gary Hill, Builders Association in New York, Lynn Hirschman, Monica Fleischman, Tim Etchells of Forced Entertainment, Blast Theory, a bunch of people who are doing fascinating things with mediation, presence, liveness, what it is to be somewhere or not. This is just another one along the way, a manifestation of some of our work on websites. We like that. We're interested in imagery, the mediation of place and space. Here, an old notion of chorography, writing on the land. It was a kind of pre-modern genre of how you dealt with space, place, and things in space and place. Generally, these projects can be seen as involving fabrication and circulation, making stuff, making things, projects that are goal-oriented. They are going to result in a product, not just abstract knowledge for its own sake. And circulation as a broader term we can apply to publication, dissemination, manifestation. The projects are hybrid. I think you'll have gathered that they kind of cut across things. Comparative, process-oriented, collaborative, and critical. We like to push the edge, push the boundary, because, frankly, we're not often too happy with the status quo, with orthodoxy, with our conventional boundaries of things. Bringing together research, theory, and practice, cutting across disciplines, fields, categories, and concepts. I'm going to elaborate on that as in the next couple of moments, but I've kind of missed out education, pedagogy, teaching from there, because they're kind of implicit in it all. All the projects we do are learning experiences. It's an ongoing learning experience, the stuff we do. This, although you can't really see so much of the detail, is one of the ways we have of running a project, this one with Daimler Chrysler. It's the front page of a wiki. The wiki has been running as a focal point for our research project into mobile media in car interiors. It's a way of organizing our team, but also of tracking, of recording our work with this corporate partner, of handling the local knowledge, the detail that gets generated in any research project, but often gets lost in the process of dissemination. That is, you explain your project to someone, simplify, reduce. What happens to the detail? Well, this is a way of tracking and managing it. It's collaborative social software. In all the projects that cut across the fields I've been describing, we're very interested in hybrid methodologies. That is, taking methodologies and cutting across them. Bringing together, in, for example, Daimler Chrysler, foresight modeling, which is Bill's thing, conventional social scientific analysis, interpretive anthropology, which is not straightforward ethnography in the way that we often understand it in a corporate environment. Local and situated methodologies, that is, they're on the fly, you adapt them to a particular local situation. They're agile and adaptive in that way, and I'm making an explicit reference here to agile management and software development. Pragmatic, because we make it up as we go along. An explicit interest in project management. Not just a methodology, but how do you get people to work together and bring them together in a management environment, a management way. An interest in tacit knowledges, algorithms, procedures, workarounds. And that's the agile and adaptive thing. To give you some idea of the kind of cross-cutting stuff that we've applied, for example, to Daimler Chrysler and some of these other projects, here are what we've been borrowing from and fooling with and goodness knows what else. Archaeological field science. I can tell you, putting 90 people in the field digging an early city in Sicily is an interesting exercise in applied science. Interpretive anthropology, I'll not say much more about it, but it is a branch of anthropology that includes ethnography. Social software, agile software development, very interested in these new developments in the digital field. But contemporary performance art as well. We're very interested, I've worked for more than 10 years now with a prominent arts company in the UK and in Europe, very interested in their collaborative efforts in producing site-specific performance. Process as well as product. Improvisation coming out of performance, academic research, corporate research, very different things. Industrial design, the beer cans, but also car design, and studio arts. My 10-year project on ceramics, for example, involved a lot of interest in studio ceramics. Here is just another manifestation of a project looking at Teotihuacan, the design of this city in Mexico, of course, but through local interest. This is an interactive collaboratively authored site that one of our lab graduates is working on. Winding up and proposition, what I believe in, and some things to put to you about this field that I think might be interesting to talk about. First, understanding through making. Jeffrey said something about this already. Heterogeneous engineering. This one takes a little bit more explanation, I'll say in a moment. The power of theory. I know you're interested in making, and there is, among many people, some serious suspicion of theory. I don't share that, but that's because I have a particular notion of how to understand theory. And also, and what I'll end with, an archaeological sensibility, we've all got it, and I suggest it's good to think through it. Understanding through making, a few catchwords that go with this, or slogans as Jeffries called them. Making things makes people. It's a fascinating relationship, anthropological issue as to people-thing relationships. We're not as separate as we might think. And that includes a component of all my projects of making archaeological things. And that's not just digging stuff up. Contemporary art as a research program. I'm absolutely firmly behind this, that the contemporary arts are a way of understanding our contemporary condition. Working with artists to that end is a fascinating enterprise. And understanding through making, I'm very interested in developer community in the Valley up in Bay Area, agile and adaptive management and development as a way of cutting through some of the problems of orthodox methodologies. Here is another side of things we do. This is a cave, immersive VR environment in London that we're using to model presence. We're constructing environments to understand what it is to be somewhere. Heterogeneous engineering, challenging categories of classifications at the heart of making, because most making involves, cutting a good, innovative, creative making, involves combining different things in cultural ecologies. Things, people, ideas, values, structures, pathways, flows, circulations, whatever. And it's a term I take from the sociology and history of technology. John Law coined it a while ago. The power of theory, but not as abstraction. Theory is thoughtful, reflective practice. The power of theory has undoubtedly enabled a team of archaeologists and anthropologists to work with a corporation like Daimler Chrysler. I could say more of that if we ever wanted. And finally, then, this archaeological sensibility. There are material processes at the heart of our social fabric which are archaeological. And these include sensitivity, sensibilities that are to do with time, temporality, history, historical trajectory, reuses of the past, revisiting the past, working on the past in the present, even if it is to deny that very historical rooting that is often conceived to be so central to contemporary identities. It's at the heart of our contemporary people-think relationships. And the sensibility also includes a strong component of the mediation, media work at the heart of so many of our projects, which is to do a representation. All the connotations of that word, remediation and reperformance. And this is how we see theatre archaeology, as the rearticulation of fragments of the past as real-time event. And that's just to kind of end on as a way of kind of hopefully opening up some questions if you haven't understood a word I've said.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I want to know a lot more about garbageology, and if that in fact is what we'll be able to talk about that more as we proceed. The next speaker is Henry Lowen, and he's going to speak, I guess, about gaming and about some of the work he's doing with gaming. Everybody has been asking about this, so we're looking forward to hearing more about this. So about 10 minutes, and then we'll move quickly over to the SCI-Arc presentations, move through those, and then open up for discussion. Great, thank you.
Okay, I don't have any visuals, but to make the 10 minutes, I promised to talk in bullet points. Okay, maybe that's the way I'll do it. The How They Got Game project was first formulated in the year 2000. It's in its 6th year now, which is somewhat unbelievable. We've done a number of different things, ranging from exhibits, online archive of student written case history of game design and game designers, an archive of machinima, which is game-based videos and movies and so on. And I could talk about that, but I'm going to go off in a little bit of a different direction. I'm going to talk about some of the discussion and some of the work that we've been doing, myself and the 24 or so people who are affiliated with the project, on game design and how that might maybe inform discussions about design education. I wanted to kind of put this in the context of an extension of understanding through making to making through understanding. That is, how can critical studies inform design, and especially design education? Okay, so the title, I think, if luckily we weren't asked to provide titles for this, but had I been asked to provide a title, I probably would have said something like, for game design, the designer is dead, long live the designer. And to illustrate what I'm talking about here, I want to focus on two issues that have become very clear through the historical studies that we've done in the last 5 or 6 years. One is an issue that I think plagues game designers right now and has surfaced as a problem for game design education. And the other one is an issue about who is ultimately the designer, who ultimately has creative control over games. So the first issue is about procedurality as a design issue, what we might mean by procedural design or procedural art as it's called. That's a very important concept in the design of computer games, interactive literature, and that sort of thing. And the second issue I'm going to elucidate through a discussion of the consumer as a creator, through the player as a designer, and what implications that might have. Okay, procedurality. Well, the notion of the game designer has almost become a quaint one. In the early 1980s, as game design, that is digital game design, was beginning to gain steam, it was very common for people to talk about game designers. Teams were on the order of 1 to 5 people, generally in creating a game in the early 1980s. In contrast, today, game design teams are typically, at a place like Electronic Arts, 100 to 150 or more people, teams that are interchangeable, teams that specialize in, say, biomechanics, so that if for Tiger Woods golf you need to work on the golf swing, there's a team that comes in that understands the various kinds of tweaks and so on that are useful for coming up with some new notion about Tiger Woods golf swing and so on. The idea of the author or the auteur, if you're thinking in filmic terms, a single intelligence that's driving game design, and that I'm sure that in architectural design that's probably a contested space as well. That notion has become quite fragmented under this pressure of new forms of production in game design. And procedurality has become an issue that's quite relevant in these terms. So let me give you a little vignette. Last spring, Electronic Arts convened an academic summit to talk about game design education, what needs to be done in the next 10 years. Electronic Arts was thinking in terms of something on the order of 10,000 people they will need to hire in the next 10 years, breaking down roughly as 4,995 artists and 4,995 programmers, and 10 in the other category. It's very interesting, so they talk to art schools and computer science departments about the large groups of talent that they need. Those are people who generate content, generate code, and so on. But they really have no solution for this other group of 10, 20 people, a very small group who will manage projects and so on, who will do things like translating the language of what we might call think of as the game designer to something that an artist can understand, or to make it possible for the programmers to talk to the artists. And we're talking now about games like Will Wright's Spore, in which will be coming out later in 2006, is a game in which you will be able to carry a civilization, or whatever you want to think of it as, from the first sort of plankton and cells through to a kind of galactic level. Well, there's no way that all the animations, all the graphics, all the content that's necessary for a game like that can be pre-rendered. So it's necessary for people to think in terms of scripts, in terms of procedures, so that you're not really defining the content of the game in specific terms as an author might for a book, but rather you're determining the conditions under which content may emerge in a game space. So an animator is told not, I need a rendering of this particular three-legged creature, but is told something like, the player will have complete independence to create all sorts of creatures. You have to come up with a program that will be able to render animation for any kind of creature you can imagine, showing how it might walk or fly, but without knowing what that creature will be in advance. And this is the problem of procedurality, and it's a very difficult one for game developers to work around. They don't really know what kind of person will be able to translate the big design ideas, the big intentions of a person like Will Wright into terms that make sense to programmers and artists. So that's an important issue for the future of game design and for the training of people who will work in game development companies. Well, okay, so that's one problem, and I think that one really calls into question the notion of a fixed design, of a kind of the game as a kind of a text or as a kind of a cinematic creation that's a linear narrative, and rather asks, how are we going to harness the kinds of things that can emerge within these game spaces? Okay, second, so that's one kind of problem. Another kind of problem, which is one that I've been working on quite a bit the last couple or 3 years, is the notion of the player as a creator. It's kind of the contested ownership of what happens in a game space between the designer or the developer and the player. And you have to understand, of course, that when I talk about a player, I'm talking about somebody who's already in a kind of liminal space. He's already someone who's both activating things, doing things, performing, and at the same time spectating, watching his or her own actions take place on the screen while they're being performed, right? Well, there's kind of a similar relationship nowadays between designers and players. A game is designed nowadays as an engine that produces all of the various effects of the game in real time and includes maybe a story-driven or some other kind of competitive experience or whatever that comes out of the box. But at least on personal computer platforms for games, the player is also given a whole set of tools to create their own sorts of things. You're probably familiar with the modding of games and all of that. But also we're seeing now a very active community of people making movies using games, and as I've mentioned, I'm curating the Machinima archives on the Internet Archive now. And this is a space in which people are repurposing game technology as a kind of found technology for totally different sorts of experiences and entertainment. Likewise, we're seeing people who are spending enormous amounts of their time in virtual worlds, creating characters who experience things, they sort of experience things that are co-experienced by the player and the avatar in these virtual worlds over a kind of lifetime, at which point we can really ask, who has created this character? Who is the owner of the art, etc., that maybe that character could be defined in terms of certain files on a disk and so on. Who's actually created that? Is it the player or is it the game designer? And I think this is an issue that's become very interesting. I'll point out in the space, let's say, of game movies, I'm going to give you one concrete example here for a minute. I'm sure a few of you have played World of Warcraft. I doubt it now that the number of people worldwide that play World of Warcraft has reached 6 million. It's the case, I believe the math works out right, that 1/10 of 1% of the entire population on the face of the earth plays World of Warcraft, so there's probably a few people in here who do. People have been making movies in that space, and very often we found that the movies are very similar to movies you might be familiar with from other fan cultures, like Star Trek movies, augmented reality videos, anime videos, and so on, where people are taking the content produced by publishers, published content, and then reworking it, remixing it, editing it, creating something new, in many cases asserting their ownership of that particular virtual space. Maybe they don't like something that the developer decided to do in World of Warcraft, so they make a movie about how they would prefer it if characters of one type were able to communicate with each other instead of being banned from doing that, as the game does. So these issues of who actually designs the games become very interesting at that point, when we start seeing actual contests, debates, discussion, controversy about the ownership of the characters and the content that's created in games. Well, I'm going to try to keep it short here. I just wanted to sort of pose these kinds of issues as issues that present some difficulty for design education, to the extent that design education is, at least for computer games and video games, is connected to a traditional notion of the author or the designers being in control of that medium. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Henry. I think we're just discussing the things that you guys have been saying are so interesting and fascinating. We're going to maybe depart a little bit from the original format and see if there are people on the panel maybe have questions. If people up here have questions, we'll maybe take about 10 or 15 minutes of questions, because you've laid out so many things. It's going to be hard to kind of hold that in our head and be able to respond to all the things that you've laid out. So maybe if there are questions from up here, we'll take about maybe 10, 15 minutes of questions, and then we'll sort of move over to the SCI-Arc presentations. If there are no questions, we'll go on. But there's I think they've laid out some really amazing and fascinating and interesting things. If there are questions out there, move it out. We'll take about 10 or 15 minutes. If not, then we'll go on and make our presentations with SCI-Arc.
I have a question. How do you think that public policy and political leadership can help move some of the things forward that are outside the boundaries of market relations? How can political leadership and public policy assist in these things?
Do you answer the question?
Entirely.
If I hear, maybe I'll I'll just restate the question as I heard it. How does public policy act on the kind of things that they're talking about outside of the normal kind of purview or range of architecture? Is that what you're asking?
Well, outside of the activity of just marketplace driven, how do you find political leadership or public policy assisting you in moving forward with some of your
Do you want to try that? Any of you guys want to go for that?
How does public policy help us?
I'm not really sure I understand the question.
Do we, if it kind of depends on what spin you have on public policy, but if we're talking about humanities in terms of their funding, the support, the curricula that are supported through national and international, indeed, agencies, then there's a lot of relevance. If, for example, we want to take just disciplinary boundaries and career paths, and therefore what kind of curricula in the humanities are supported because they're going to deliver certain kinds of jobs and whatever, and therefore students are going to do them. And it's absolutely fundamental that certain policy changes occur. It's about career paths and encouraging certain kinds of work. In terms of the past connections that I was circling around, again, the implication of working on the past, the digital humanities past, you don't even need the digital. The implications of working on the past are vast for public policy, because ministries of culture the world over are frankly quite obsessed with reworking pasts, humanities pasts, in all sorts of different ways. And we're actually facing some serious issues as to their preconceptions of what constitutes a human past, human culture, and its relevance to the present. So policy is absolutely fundamental to a lot of the things we're doing, if that is what you kind of meant by it.
Maybe we're going to just, I think it's very likely that Hernan will deal with this topic in his presentation, so we're probably going to move directly to an answer.
polishing and pre-polish
Oh,
my
wait,
expertise.
Eric has a question. Hang on.
Both Michael and Jeffrey made reference to this exhibition, which is at Stanford at the moment, that among other things deals with some constructivist artifacts. And in light of an attitude that suggests that you have to break down in one way or another the form of knowledge and information, which means you have to move to something which is less precedented as opposed to something which has a precedent. In conceptual terms, why would you rebuild something that was imagined early in the 20th century? How does that fit in with your pro forma?
Is this microphone? I can't tell. No, I think it is actually.
Okay, yeah.
I think
It
it's
works.
fine. Yeah. Well, actually, I think Michael sort of answered that question, although he wasn't speaking directly about the exhibition. That is, in this case, we're dealing with structures that were never built, for which there are no technical drawings. Therefore, they are, by their very nature, speculative, interpretive exercises in three-dimensional scholarship, if you like. So in that sense, I think they merge with this larger mission. And part of the mission involves enriching our sense of what, I mean, when we tend to talk about media history or new media, we tend to have a very small, very narrow time horizon, and I think the presence of an archaeologist here, and by the way, my training is as a medievalist, the pre-modern is well represented on the SHL side of the panel here. I think that this sense that the really interesting, innovative, creative ways of thinking of the potential of the digital revolution on its potential impact on rethinking categories of knowledge and models of presentation of knowledge, as well as the production of knowledge, which I think is right at the core of the mission of the Humanities Lab, has a lot to do with thinking about old media and recovering for the history of media, for instance, print itself, manuscript culture, which is where I started in my own interest in the sort of materiality of communicational systems. Not to mention the garbage and the detritus of the remote past. So I think they are of a piece in our conception. I think I'm speaking for Michael as well.
Yeah, I would say as well, you know, it's kind of media archaeology. This thing was never constructed. It's been repurposed. And it isn't the same thing. If we accept that, you know, what something is, your experience of it is contextual, it's situated, it's local. Yes, it may take the same form, but here it is in an exhibition space, in an art center, in a university on the west coast of the United States. And it creates very interesting effects that can't be put across by writing it down. It's the remediation of the past in the present, which creates very, very interesting effects, experientially, but also in terms of knowledge. You know, so much of our knowledge of the past cannot be reduced to textual form. It is ineffable. So much of our world is something which is tacit. It's not brought to discourse. We don't speak of it. We live it, whatever that means and whatever gloss you want to give on it. So why reconstruct it? Because it does all of this, as well as what Jeffrey was saying.
I have one very quick question maybe for Michael and for Henry. It really has to do with the model that you laid out at the end, which is the model of the designer as player. And it also gets picked up in your idea of the whole wiki and the way you guys work with wikis. I wonder just pedagogically, how, in terms of design education, how do you work with those things, and how do you construct a curriculum, or how do you construct a design studio or a design project that's wiki-based, or at least that uses wiki as a principal kind of component of design? I know architects, this is, in my view, this is a huge threat to the individual genius designer that I think architecture is still saddled with to a large degree, although what really happens in the end, I think, works much more like what you're talking about. But I just wonder, pedagogically, how do you construct courses? How do you construct a curriculum around these ideas?
Yeah, I was posing it as a threat, as a question in a way. That was kind of what what I was hoping to do. I'm glad that you received it that way. You know, I was kind of thinking, how do I relate in a way to architecture, because I'm not intimately familiar enough with architectural design kind of education to know whether, to what extent the viewpoint of, say, the player in an architectural space is taken into consideration. And the only way I can express that, and I should say, by the way, that game developers think of the spaces they create as architectures, right? And angles and photographs, let's say, of different sorts of spaces, but actually as narrative experiences through a space. So I think one part of the design education that could be very exciting in terms of interdisciplinarity between game studies, architecture, and new media would be an intense discussion of non-textual narrative and the ways in which spaces can be used to tell stories. I think this, by the way, would also tie in very well to archaeological concerns with places and spaces and the way stories change over time and that sort of thing. Another thing, I'm thinking actually of a course on the consumer as a creator and trying to get around that as a critical investigation. It's kind of a critical focus for a class, and a part of it is really working through the play experience as a design experience. What players do, and you can talk about consumers of other media as well, what they do to actually take ownership of their interaction with a particular medium. I think that's something that is breaking to the surface now. It started mostly with investigations of fan communities. If you're familiar with Henry Jenkins' work, for example, it's just starting. Strangely enough, there are very few people in game studies, which is a very rapidly growing field now, who focus on player culture. There are very few people who do that. Most people doing critical investigation of games are much more comfortable with looking at games as texts, as cinematic experiences, maybe reporting their own experience in playing a game, but very rarely do they engage very deeply in what players are actually doing, whether it be competitive play experiences or the kinds of things I was describing in massively multiplayer games.
Michael, yeah, you want to say something about the wikis?
Yeah, I mean, you're very familiar, I know, in your world with project-based learning. It's what we've been talking about, it's what we're talking around. If we think of wikis less as kind of this genre, this category, but much more in terms of their functions, maybe it's possible to see how useful or not they are. Wikis are simply online environments where a bunch of people have a space, a virtual space, well, it's not really virtual, it's there, a space that can be more or less central to their teamwork. Okay, so what is it that happens in the space? Three basic functions. First, editing. So you can put text up, you can put images up, and you can change other people's editing. And these three functions are meant to be easy. Okay, so there's editing. Second, linking. You connect stuff together, which is at the core, of course, of teamwork. But it's easy within a wiki environment. And again, any digital kind of material potentially, no, any digital material can be easily linked. And the third thing is searching and finding. So those are the three functions. And really that's kind of generic. It's just that wikis are meant to make that easy. And I would say that, you know, potentially they're at the heart of any kind of project-based learning. But there's something else, a whole series actually of effects that come into play when you go even further and start looking at the architecture of a wiki. And essentially what they are there's a database background to them. You're interacting with the database in terms of the three basic functions. So you're collecting information together and working with it. And this is the crucial thing. It's bottom-up categorization and construction. So rather than predefine the information you're sharing, you're defining it on the fly as you go along. And what you can do with most wikis is what Henry was getting onto here, which is you can generate, track, record sequences, even stories of interaction with the data, with each other. So the wikis build in stories of you working together. And it's relatively easy to access that and see what people have done and how they've got on together. So you can track changes in your activity. So in a sense, all wikis are about are not wikidom or anything like that. It's about helping us, you know, work together more effectively, perhaps. as teams. The downside, and I think that a lot of people find, is that they're not necessarily easy and intuitive to use. Even though the functions that I've described may be easy to implement, when you get a bunch of people working together in this way, where everybody can edit everybody else's work, where you can quite easily not have anyone in control, but let the system, develop emergent or produce emergent effects, and as I say, categorize and classify on the fly, then it gets disconcerting. It's very messy. It can, there can be a lot of lack of order, of not entropy, but just messiness, and it isn't as tight as we're used to often seeing in much more controlled, managed, directed team environments. And that can be disconcerting, and people don't get on with it so much. So it's a kind of different culture. But nevertheless, I think an interesting one to think about and learn from.
Okay, maybe we can pick up on that and expand and have a little more discussion about that later on. We're going to move quickly now to the SCI-Arc presentation. The idea for this event was really for SHL to present to us the kind of things that they're doing, the different kinds of design approaches and the way that they think about design and design education. And for us, SCI-Arc, to present to them, because actually they haven't seen a lot of our own work and they haven't been here, they think it's a terrific place. But we want to show them some of the kinds of design approaches that we take to education here. So we'll have three presentations, the first one by Hernan Diaz Alonso, Wes Jones, and then Eric. And then we'll open up a discussion to the panel and everybody else after that. So I know that because architects are incredibly disciplined, that there's no question that we'll stick to 10 minutes each on these, but in the event that we don't, we'll try to stop it. Yeah.
I can guarantee my part after the other two.
Yeah,
I'm not responsible for them. I'm going to try to move as quick as I can. I think it's much more important, the discussion, than to show each of our work. I'm just interested in is this working? Yeah. A couple of points in terms of the notion of the practice, the teaching, and the whole notion of research. And I was thinking an interesting way to frame is a typical question that usually happens to me in airplanes when they ask you, what do you do? I'm an architect, and the first question is, what do you do, commercial or residential? My answer is, not really. And I always have a hard time trying to explain to them what the hell is what I do. So for me, the whole notion of this idea of research, and I don't believe that much in those distinctions. I think the way that, especially in the context of a place like SCI-Arc, the way that I think the big majority of the faculty operate is like we are this kind of a monster with multiple legs. Then research, practice, teaching is all part of the same kind of material and territories. So the only 2 points are interesting to make. One is kind of an egg-chicken kind of notion in the sense of how the work, in terms of what I teach here at studios and seminars, especially when I teach vertical studios, that they became like a platform for me as an idea to explore where we're going in terms of what I'm interested to push the work. What drives my ideas of teaching and working have to do a lot with the notion of techniques and the relation of techniques and the production of aesthetics. So techniques is a dialogue that moves very fast, and most of the time the students became better than you very, very fast. So the teaching became like a fundamental part in terms of how we keep refreshing the ideas and how we explore toward the future. So everything that I'm interested in teaching is never based on what we're doing exactly at the time in the office or what we did, but what we're trying to push. So for me, office teaching and so on, that distinction doesn't exist. And I think in that sense, SCI-Arc is a very unique place because I think the big majority of the faculty here are practitioners and not academics in the traditional sense. So I think that produced a whole series of mutations and hybridization that for me is interesting. So, for example, this work is the work of my students of the last semester in the spring. It was a studio called Fleshology, which was an attempt, it was a collaboration with a seminar with Benjamin Bratton, which was an attempt to start to move beyond the problem of certain condition of form, multiplicity, incremental variations, to cellular aggregation and move from surface into flesh. I'm just going to go through and try to figure and show you 2 examples of 2 different projects that we did in the office in a similar time of when we were doing this studio work. So to start to see how each of them start to become a territory that is contaminating the other one as it goes back and forth. So this is still the student work. And out of this, in the exploration with the studio, there were two main things that they were fundamental in terms of the development of the other two projects. One was the idea of the cinematic effects and the notion of these new technologies and techniques. They have to do much more with this notion of simulations, but also the way how cells can aggregate and start to create multiple configurations and start to go beyond the traditional notion of Cartesian form. So the other aspect they have to do with this notion of collaborations. I really don't like the work of interdisciplinary thing. I never understood that because I think architecture by nature operates in multiple scales and you collaborate with a lot of people because it requires many aspects. So one of the aspects that was part of the investigation of the laboratory exploration that we were doing with the students have to do with cell aggregation and how that can accumulate and can produce like an aesthetic that emerges as a byproduct of that. And it have to do with kind of the grotesque and the horrific. So this is a project that we did for PS1 MoMA. It was a competition for a Familion that we won. And this project took on one of the aspects, which was the idea of accumulation and incremental transformations of the cells. I'm not going to explain what the project is. I don't think it's the purpose of today's discussion. It's much more about how the work in the office inform what we do in the school and how the school inform the work that we do in the office and such. So the tradition of SCI-Arc for me in that sense has been absolutely fundamental. Not the tradition, sorry. The organization, the way to operate SCI-Arc has been absolutely fundamental in the way the work that I've been producing here teaching, but also in the work that we've been producing in the office, and how the work as a practitioner has been developing and the collaboration that you set up with the students, with the other faculty, and how the work start to operate. So as I was saying, some of the students start to get better than you with the technique and they became part of the teams. And in the case of the PS1 pavilion that we have to build in New York in 7 weeks, so a bunch of faculties of SCI-Arc and a bunch of students of SCI-Arc became involved in building it. So the whole notion of research and practice in a place like SCI-Arc, those boundaries, they really don't exist. I mean, what you design in the office became part of what you do with the students and how you develop and how you will fabricate it and how you will incorporate new technologies and how you will incorporate new methodologies and all methodologies about how to produce this kind of work. So when we build the pavilion with half of the team in LA, half of the team in New York, and the guys that were in the studio that was showing the last semester became like key players in the process because they were totally familiarized with many of these methodologies, with the notion to produce scripts and the way how a script can inform geometry and control it, and a script not as a way to produce form, but also a script as a way to produce information, and that it will help us to produce the amount of drawings, and we need to build this in this kind of ridiculous amount of time with a ridiculous budget that we have. But the most important part was like this project will tackle on one aspect, on one of the two things that were emerging out of the studio. So really, the studio's explorations are never based on certainties. They are always based in, this is kind of high-tech conditions of the project. It's never based on a predetermined agenda. It's much more based in a series of techniques and methodologies that we want to explore, and how that can start to generate or grow architecture that can behave in a different way than it was original intention. So mostly of the research I've been doing in SCI-Arc and in the office have to do much more with the problem of aesthetic and emergence aesthetic that came as a byproduct of the technique, and a kind of, I wouldn't say meaningless work, but certainly work that the meaning is not a predetermined condition. It's something that would emerge much more as a byproduct. So for those who was asking about policy and people, there's people. Which I don't like them that much, but I was very happy, especially that one. But I was very happy that the architecture heard them. So the other project that I want to show you is a project that it tackled the other aspect of what was emerging out of that studio. We have to do with the grotesque and the horrific, but also the notion of cell aggregation to produce a non-Cartesian order of form organization. This is a series of concepts that we are developing for a very famous cells cell phone company, which I cannot mention, but the name is there. So basically the idea was to start to keep developing, to take to the next level all this exploration of cellular aggregation and scripting, and how we can push the idea that the design is something that can be growth, and start to develop like a genetic series of code. So we convinced them that what they're buying from us actually is a DNL cell system and not the project itself. So that maybe is the commercial part of the practice, and for sure this is not going to become residential. So this is, for example, how the cell system can configure a display organization that can organize the storage space. It doesn't matter that much about what the project is about. It's much more about, as I said, I'm much more interested to make this case about how things inform the other, how the teaching research inform the practice research and vice versa, but also how in a place like SCI-Arc you can experiment about how to fabricate, how to make this, and how the students became part of the team that collaborated on this. So it became this kind of incestuous conditions, incestuous in a good way, if there is such thing. This is another part of the cell evolution about the packaging part, and how this can become the charger for the cell phone, and so on. And the last piece is the headset, the headphone, which will be some sort of a tattoo, which operates like an artificial skin that you can add into your face, and it can be reconfigured and so on. And believe it or not, they're going for it. So we're going to do some of this, but that is a different story. So just to conclude, some pictures of the prototypes. Then we build, with the help of all the people in the team, in the office, and in the school are part of the same thing. So to wrap it up, I think this idea of the research and practice and how we operate in these territories, I think it has to do with how we can grow from being maybe wildly chaotic, which I consider the ultimate research planner, and into became maybe, if it's possible, to become the road runner, which seems to be a guy who knows more what he's doing. But I think the architects operate in this territory, and certainly the kind of architects that are involved in a place like SCI-Arc, which I think is always in this ambiguity between this constant searching for the impossible and try to figure out how the impossible can be achieved if that paradox can operate as a possible territory for critical thinking. That's it.
Well, thanks, Hernan. You're a consummate professional. The first person to finish tonight in exactly 10 minutes. So we'll move on to Wes Jones now. And I think Wes is going to... You ready?
Yes, I'm not sure I'm quite as professional as that. The only way I could possibly hope to keep to time was to put it down ahead of time. I'm going to tap Hernan on the shoulder or whatever and take my notes from this machine here.
Okay.
So I could be seen as representing, say, the practice assholes here at the school, the majority of the faculty who are practicing architects but who also teach. SCI-Arc is unique in the sort of such faculty it attracts, and in the closeness of the connection of even these practices to the teaching here. Next. These are not full-time academics with practices on the side. We, or my firm, is a practice that, while jealous of the disciplinary boundaries of architecture, sees no bounds to the possibilities of design in or of the environment. Indeed, in contrast to others who may consider architecture's limitations anachronistically confining and seek to introduce all sorts of bullshit from outside in order to juice up architecture or rebel from it, we think the other way around. The strength of the discipline is exportable, and design in general would benefit from architecture's capacity for judgment and refinement and sophistication. Architecture is way older than product design, for example, and so it should be the one offering advice, not vice versa. So we don't see it as augmented architecture, but as architectural augmentation. We aren't buying we're selling. Architecture travels. Architecture has something to say about almost anything.
Oh, yeah.
Consequently, we look for situations to consider architecturally, places where an expanded view of architecture might be of benefit. That journey is worthwhile to take in school also, in order to look back on architecture to see it from a different perspective, or to defamiliarize it so that its true nature may be more visible to the students. The studios I've conducted here are concerned with different ways of getting architecture to reveal to us its disciplinary core. A studio researching the tectonics of plate steel taught us what it feels like to build an architecture up from an axiomatic tectonic moment. In the studio, we familiarized ourselves with the properties of the material in an introductory sculptural exercise. Then we designed systems of construction that could take advantage of those properties. These particular students noticed that the rigidity that is paradoxically introduced to the sheet surface at the moment of failure, and created a mechanism for producing this failure in a controlled and repeatable manner. The resulting tectonic expression could then be queried for its own architectural possibilities, and the relationship between the two shed light on the historical or more general condition. This scheme here was by another student, though, who took a less systematic approach to deformation, but figured out how to get the flat plates to span by folding along a score line. The present semester, the studio is using science fiction as a lever to understand the inner workings of the architectural equation, teaching us about architecture's unusually hardy provisionality, only this time without the crutches of anthropocentrism. In this studio, we are inventing architecture for environments different than anything humans might have experienced in order to see what it takes to even get to architecture. This makes us appreciate more what architecture is, but also feel the precariousness of that establishment. Now, these images here are actually stand-ins from some of the speculative projects we've done in the office for near-term future work, since we haven't yet produced our final work yet in the studio this semester. The previous image that you saw up there was done for Peter Zellner's Empire show recently. And this one here was commissioned by Time Magazine for their year 2000 millennial issue on how we will live in the year 2025. The work of the practice I'd like to show more comprehensively, though still not exhaustively by any stretch, is concerned with the notion of movement, though, and the idea that this should be a fairly normal constituent of architecture. In that studio, we considered how movement challenges architecture's constitutional fixity, highlighting its essential provisionality. This work attempts to show how architecture could embrace this new dimension without disciplinary loss. This is a movement. This is...
Okay, hold on.
Do you know how to do that?
No, because probably it's not linked.
This next one is actually a little movie of a building moving, dancing, as you can all see here, that one of the students did during the studio. This must be a cross-platform problem, going from Mac to PC. This project from the studio captures a sense of architecturally appropriate scale of movement, and I think if you could see it, it would have illustrated beautifully the potential of an architectural choreography. But I'll just go on to the next one. And there was a little dig about Calatrava in there. Since there's so little time, I'll address very briefly only the work in our practice that is specifically concerned with movement. Since architecture's job is to place us in the world, to reflect in enduring form the sense we have of our location in the scheme of things, it's hard to understand how, in today's world, movement could be excluded from architectural consideration. In some projects, we use movement to soup up the conventions as here in our astronauts memorial treatment of the usual polished black granite slab with names on it. This slab rotates and tilts throughout the day to track the sun. The mirror, as you can see in the back, reflects sunlight through the names that are cut through the mirror, polished black granite, so that the glowing names appear to float in the reflected sky. And this is the rest of the Time magazine project I showed you earlier. We call the suburb. Get it? Since this is for 2025, movement is assumed across the board, or in this case, across the roof. Here, the garage access is pedaled back and forth, mowing the lawn and charging the household batteries. This is the vehicle we designed to go with it. It's only 1 person wide, so it doubles or triples the number of lanes you could have on the freeway. In a future of movement, who wants to be stuck in traffic? On the inside, the space is maximized using what we call the ProDeck, or program deck system that we patented, which bundles the program for each room into a moving cabinet that is accessed only when needed and stacked away when not. So less room overall is used at any one time. Because after all, at this point, 80% of the rooms in any suburban house today are unoccupied at any given time, wasting a lot of space and leading to sprawl. We'll try anything to get movement and flexibility into a project, including segmented garage doors, casters, accordion systems, and lift tables from Granger to turn a conference table into a coffee table or model stand. Movement at the scale of furniture is generally easier to accomplish, but if the furniture is important, then even it may approach the architectural, as in this souped-up version of the Corbeau-Perriand chaise we did a few years back. Movement can remind us about the fundamental truth that we are bodies or mechanisms in space. Here, a lawn chair, get it, repeatedly enacts the primal moment when the ground rose up first time to meet the butt and the first chair was created. Movement can solve otherwise intractable problems elegantly. It can be like introducing a 4th dimension of space hidden right in the midst of the other 3. In this proposal for the new boardroom, cafeteria, and seminar space here conducted as a competition among the faculty at SCI-Arc, there was only enough room for 2 of these 3 program elements. So if there needed to be activity in all 3, well, that would be a problem. This problem was compounded by the fact that the structure is listed, so no permanent addition to the exterior was allowed. We thought that maybe an impermanent one might work, though. This approach is rendered slightly more elegant by the fact that SCI-Arc does not own, and thus cannot use, the ground over which the extra space projects. The seminar room or a cafeteria is merely borrowing the air rights. One of the additional benefits of introducing movement into architecture, at least for our practice, is all the cool stuff it takes to make this work. Who needs decoration when you've got industrial-rated, architecturally scaled drawer slides to slide parts of the building around? Of course, this stuff might be hidden, or at least could be less in your face, but we figured that since this was a school, it would be a learning opportunity to see it, maybe like the plaster casts of Parthenon friezes from the old days. Movement can be quite a bit lower tech, too, but still be engaging, as in this sunshade apparatus we designed for our batch plant dispatch facility up in Oakland. The panels are painted ply, riding on skateboard wheels in simple channel tracks. Movement need not be so overtly mechanical. This school of fish demising system for the San Jose State Museum of Art would have waved around throughout the day as necessary to reconfigure the space for different activities. We've done several schemes that involve moving houses on their lots, one of which we are building now in Phoenix. This one was for a site in Redondo Beach, but the planning department rejected it because they felt it was necessary to know precisely where the house would be located on the site. We tried to convince them it would always be within the setbacks, but they weren't buying it. There are many advantages to be able to move around on a site like this, including tuning the exposure to the sun, providing for larger outdoor activity services, creating varied yard divisions to separate family members, enjoying a variety of different types of yards from different rooms in the house. I don't know why everyone doesn't have one. This project, second to last, was less ambitious, but still movement worked into every aspect of it, from the unbuilt sunshades to the practically unliftable 2-ton double-hung window. On the interior of the triple-height main space, there's a moving platform that traverses the space at the first level up. It includes guardrails that fold flat to increase the area when the inspector isn't around, and is moved with a hand crank. We had designed it to include the kitchen counter as well, with the sink and stovetop. A degree of flexibility the owner decided in the end wasn't really necessary. It would have deployed from the underside of the platform when needed. You can also see the guardrails coming down here. The rest of the kitchen, including the refrigerator, is hidden behind those wood panels in the back. The counter could thus have been located wherever the party required in the triple height space. The feasibility of delivering power on the move was proven here at SCI-Arc in our Shuffle exhibition in the gallery last fall. This project was not intended to feature movement, though. Rather, the movement was just to facilitate the repositioning of 3 columns into different configurations within the space. The point was that the students would be able to experience the power in even a point column to determine spatial character by comparing the sense of the space between different arrangements. But the typical viewer saw the movement as the point, distracting them from the spatial dynamics it was actually intended to support. Movement at an architectural scale is seductive that way. And maybe that's really the best reason architecture should bring it into the fold, so it doesn't eventually end up competing with it and losing. That's it.
Thank you, Wes. That was terrific. So we have one more presentation from SCI-Arc. Eric Moss, the director of the school.
Thanks very much, Michael. I want to talk about this in a slightly more philosophical way. It's interesting to me to listen to a series of presentations in a school where knowledge is not a certainty or a method or a system, but is to some extent speculative, which means, in a sense, we together, team, students, faculty, have to find a way to learn to draw what we don't know how to draw, or to understand the subject matter that's ahead of us and not behind us. So that for all the discourse about speculation and the quizzical nature of the future, in some cases what we've been hearing and what we've been looking at seem to have to do, to some extent, with a mastery of a subject matter, as opposed to some kind of tension between what you know or think you might know and what you don't know. And the question is really how to find out or how to move forward into a venue that you don't yet recognize. I think what I want to do is talk about something that we did about 6 or 7 years ago with the LA Phil, which failed. It broke, it fell down, it collapsed, all of that, which is also a way of learning and understanding. This is a painting you may know. It's called The Blind Leading the Blind, which isn't to suggest education at SCI-Arc is entirely about the blind leading the blind. Pedagogies have heroes, and whether it's a mathematical tradition, a philosophical tradition, an archaeological tradition, or an architectural tradition, there is a history. And the history has critical points, it has critical figures, it has heroes. To some extent, I think it's important to understand, I don't want to be your hero, nor does Jeffrey, nor does Henry, nor does Michael, nor does Wes, nor does Hernan. In theory, we don't want to be your heroes. So there's something about this discussion that has to do with taking our model and our example and turning it back on us in a critical way. Next. This is an early sketch. Most of the work that we do, that comes out of my office, has to do with exploratory drawings that I make. There's something about this. This was done for the LA Philharmonic, which has a series of concerts called the Green Umbrella Series. It's run for about 12 years. And it's what they call new music. The new music discussion takes place, or has taken place, at the Japan American Theater. And at a certain point, about 6, 8 years ago, when the Disney Concert Hall garage was built, but it looked like the hall would not be built, Fleischman and Esapeka and Peter Sellers came to us, and they asked us to do a smaller version for the Philharmonic, which would suggest an amalgamation between architecture and music. It's an old discussion. The question was how to do that, and we began to investigate that subject. Next. And the sketch you saw was really a sensibility or an instinct. I put this up because at the time we were working, Esapeka did a program, I guess it was at the Chandler, and that program was music by Sibelius in a film, famous film made in 1928, featuring Lillian Gish, called The Wind. What the hell is the wind? And how to make the wind in a medium like film had to do with Indians and the Wild West and so on. And the film became a very primitive animation, of which this is one piece, of a horse in the sky, flying in the sky. And what interests me about that, and I hope is ultimately part of this discussion, and I think in some way this is a reconciliation of a lot of the different subjects, whether it's game theory, archaeology, the work West showed, the work Hernan showed, but it has to do with inventing something, an image or a sensibility which has no a priori form, doesn't really exist. So Sibelius, who is the filmmaker, Sibelius, who is the musician, Victor Seastrom, who was the filmmaker, had to invent an image for the screen which communicated the sense of wind. What's the wind as a form, as an effect, as a consequence? It has no form. Now it had a form. Next. This was the first of a series of models which was illustrative of this, both an indoor facility for about 400 people and an outdoor facility that would seat 20 of the musicians of the LA Philharmonic under this canopy. Next. And we began to model that roof, which turned out to be a glass roof. The explanation for the roof in a disingenuous way was that somehow it had to do with acoustics and the form of sound, but actually it had to do with a very different sensibility about the relationship of music and architecture. And we were trying to model something, and I think this is worth thinking about, which has a conceptual meaning or a conceptual form, but also has to translate into a technical or constructible form. So they were trying to understand what it could be as a configuration, and simultaneously trying to understand how it might be implemented. And what was, I think, of interest about this is that at the time it was done, the roof is glass, there was no bent glass. This turns out to be a laminated roof, so there are two sections of glass laminated together, and it wasn't clear that it could be done or who could do it. Actually, it turned out that at the time, we were doing a competition for a media center at Stanford, and we bumped into some of Foster's work. For the medical school, Foster was using somebody to bend glass who happened to be in San Pedro by the name of Kelly Green, company called California Bending. And we began to integrate that technology into this project next. We had, of course, the ubiquitous and well-known engineering firm, Swiss and French young engineers from a firm called ASI, which is worldwide. And when you're looking at the red means it's going to break and it won't work, but there were a whole series of discussions about bending glass, analyzing the capacity of glass to bend and be reconfigured. And what was important in the end is that the engineers and the fabricators couldn't agree on the capacities for the glass, spoke different languages, spoke different form languages, used different media. So part of our job was to reconcile those opposing points of view, and ultimately to construct the roof next. Part of what we do, I think, in the office has to do with a tangible, palpable, weighted, gravity-connected, doesn't mean it couldn't be ethereal, aspect of construction. I think one of the concerns that has to do with the ubiquitous animation in the computer is it tends to produce a sensibility which conceivably has nothing to do with the issues of implementation. So potentially there's a contradiction between what occurs on a monitor, what occurs on a screen, and the capacity to build it, which is conceivably different and requires a different kind of information. We started to make forms and explore whether it was steel, whether it was plaster, however we might do it in order to bend the glass. Next. What's curious about this painting, this is another old painting, the 19th century painting, some of you know, done by Seurat. And the reason I show it is because I think there's an amalgamation of new and old that inevitably takes place that we have to keep in mind. So nothing is entirely an antique or a piece of archaeology, whatever that may mean, nor is it entirely new. And what was always fascinating to me about this is that at the time it was done, the subject matter on the bank of the Seine, everybody's in the right place, wearing the right clothes, and so on. So the subject matter is extremely conservative, old, antique, predictable, recognizable. But the technique, the physical technique for making the painting, the dots, was unique and revolutionary. So what you have is an amalgamation between two very different qualities. And I think you'll find almost inevitably in what we do that there is that kind of hybridization of something that's exploratory and novel and something which is precedented. It has a history. So it's always the history. If we want to move it forward, it is nevertheless inevitably both historical and unhistorical simultaneously. Next. This is one of the forms that we ultimately, there are 17 of these, there's 17 pieces, they're all different. This is for example. Next. We went through a number of discussions about how to make it, how to bend it, how to laminate it, all of that. Next. And ultimately how to install it. Next. This is, I think, suggestive of the notion that knowledge has to do with prognosis. Prognosis has to do with predictability. Predictability has to do with, I know yesterday, I know today, ergo I'll understand tomorrow, which in an exploratory sense oughtn't to be so, meaning what we know today doesn't inevitably allow us to say what mañana will be. Next. Witness this, and this went on actually for about 6 months or so. Pieces were breaking, were falling apart, discussions with engineers, discussing with clients, with banks, all of that. The fascinating, somebody asked a question about public policy, and ultimately one of the questions in this wasn't only how to draw it, how to design it, how to implement it, but how to keep people who had very different perspectives on how to build, how to construct, in what time frame, for what cost, how to keep all those people together. Next. This is a map. Mapping is another subject that I think might be a part of this discussion, only because in our sense, if we don't think about it deeply, a map tells you where to go. So it tells you what was, and it suggests what will be. But I think my point would be that maps are never right. They're inevitably incorrect. And most interesting maps are maps that are in process. This happens to be the famous Amerigo Vespucci, who you all know and love. And this this comes from early in the, late in the 15th century, at the time when he was coming to what was, in their terms, the New World. But it's fascinating to see the pieces, I think, and to understand that somebody understood that this was the way it was. This is the way to understand, this is the way to think, this is the way to move, and in fact, this was presumably an accurate representation of something which, of course, it was not. But it was, I think, and what interests me about this process is that if you understand a map as an a priori way of understanding, it's very different than if you understand a map as something which itself evolves. And my sense is that when we work together, and part of the SCI-Arc discussion has to do with not so much receiving maps, although that's inevitably part of it, what's historically an aspect of our discipline, but of making the maps ourselves. So we're map makers, not simply readers of maps. Next. So it went up. Next. This suggests to me something which I'll just leave as an open question. It has to do with what a building might be. What's a door? What's a wall? What's a floor? What's a window? What's a building? And in terms of the current discussions in New Orleans, what a city might be. So if you think that that is an open question or an open discussion, I think we agree. Next. Next. One from out of the sky. This is one of the Martian moons. It's called Phobos. And it also is a reflection of astronomical laws of physics. It's supposed to be round. It's supposed to rotate in a certain direction. It's not round. It rotates in the opposite direction. So for me, it's a productive example and a useful example of a study which leads to a model, which leads to a revision, a substantial revision of the study. Next. And finally, ultimately, in constructing that glass, less from the outside than from the inside, the view of the world turns out to be very, very different. New view, new world, new point of view. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. So now we have, I forget what we do next. I think what we had originally planned is that we would have a kind of a roundtable discussion, which would include the presenters and some visiting people from out of town, but also some Stanford faculty and some SCI-Arc faculty. I'll introduce those people. If they have an observation they want to make about presentations, or if they want to sort of draw some of these things together, we can start there. If I suspect you all may have some questions you want to ask the architectural presenters, but I'll introduce the people who would be on a roundtable if we had a huge roundtable and we're sitting around it and having a discussion. Bill Cocaine, who was referred to earlier, who is also a director at the Stanford Humanities Lab, and I think is involved in their a program that connects a lot with what Eric was just talking about, which is foresight. And maybe Bill will have something to say about it, particularly about what Eric was just suggesting about prediction and about sort of speculating about things that you can't speculate about. Maria Go, who's an art historian, faculty at Stanford. Ming Fan, head of the graduate program at SCI-Arc. Chris Getting, head of the undergraduate program at SCI-Arc. And if Brett Steele hasn't left,
It's in the back.
maybe Brett would come a little closer and enjoy the conversation. Brett is the director of the Architectural Association School of Architecture, and also former director of what I think is maybe one of the most innovative and exciting programs of architecture anywhere, which is the DRL. So maybe we'll the Design Research Lab. We'll throw it open to anybody who wants to ask a question. Maybe it would be useful, especially if the panelists have initial observations about the presentations, and maybe we'll start by treating the visitors as
just doing idea capture. And they decided that most tools that existed out there, project planning and things like that, were utterly horrible for doing unstructured idea capture among an individual or among a team, and for later allowing people to look at it. And all they adopted these tools for was just for the fact that they were entirely unstructured. And these were the first set of tools they had that were networked and shareable and searchable and just utterly open to allowing people to put anything down, change anything, write anything they wanted, post pictures all day long. And this has actually become really one of the biggest new changes, new tools being adopted in this course. This course adopts, been going for 15 years, they adopt new tools every year. This is the first time they've adopted a tool in the first year that people actually like it and people continue to use it. And they're now kind of, it's interesting, the wikis as of this week have officially died because people have now moved beyond the idea stage. And it was great that the things existed in these non-structured forms, and now they need to get them into structured forms. So they've all put them into PowerPoint and project and things like that. And I expect the wikis will never see any usage again for the next 6 months. So interesting use.
I wanted to ask a very general question, but it was something that came up in particular in Henry's talk, where you were talking about the consumer as a designer. And I think there was a lot of people, there was a lot of discussion sort of circulating around that idea. And I was wondering if you might have anything to say, anybody actually might have anything to say about the designed subject, like the human body, which had a kind of fleeting presence in the panel presentations. You know, your project, people got hurt by it, like, or you know, the body kind of had a very
proud of it.
I know, yeah, I know. But just more generally, like, what about the design subject, like the notion of, you know, everybody redesigns their body with, you know, design of drugs or you know, design of clothes, design of surgery, and so on. So what about the human subject in this discussion?
Anybody want to try that? Hernan seems the obvious person to have to answer that question since architecture hurts.
I'm not so sure in terms of the question that you asked. I mean, I think it's the whole idea of the redesign of the body. I think is a fascinating subject. One of the things that interests me in terms of when it does the work is how you displace, I mean, how you force the human body or the human to interact and how they can decodify it and how they can use this kind of architecture that are operating in different territories. So I'm very interested in the effective condition of how architecture can interact with the body. So I'm much more interested in the notion of challenging the human than please the human or provide any kind of direct answer to it. For me, that was one of the most fascinating by product when we did that pavilion, because they keep telling us every Saturday, 7,000 people are going to camp here. And for me, it didn't mean anything until you see the 7,000 people there, and you see how each of them try to behave and try to understand how they can use it, and the way they would approach the relation between that sort of a body of a monster that you put in there with their own bodies. For me, it was like a whole totally byproduct. It was something that we didn't expect at all, but at the same time, operating within the logic that we were doing, which was trying to challenge that. So, to tell you the truth, until now, the presence of that in the design hasn't been like a main issue. But it fascinates me how that interact when that get put to the consideration of the use or whatever we call it.
Yeah, I think Eric has a response.
One of the issues that we're involved with that may relate to what you're talking about has to do with how one moves through a space and comes to understand it. And that's not necessarily the same as going to Chichen Itza and crawling through a pyramid in terms of the aperture which is currently available in order somehow to make more tangible the experience either of the builder or the burglar or whoever it was. It's not so much a matter, I think, for us of trying to confine the body or contort the body or force the body. It has more to do with the fact that if you think understanding has something to do with multiple perspectives, then you might, for instance, put somebody on the top of the space and under the space and in various positions moving through the space, whether it has to do with questions of movement in the space or climbing up on the space. You can make it very tangible and palpable, and that goes back to a sense of a conceptual sense that I think means that you don't ever understand in a fundamental way by understanding only in a fundamental way, meaning you have to move and you have to see a number of things from a number of vantage points. So that might be a strategy, but it's not the Champs-Élysées strategy. It's a different kind of strategy. It has to do with putting people in multiple positions, and then they can come to their conclusion.
Yeah, let me just suggest maybe a preliminary notion that relates to that might come out of game design. I think fundamentally there's an issue with the designer's control over what has been created and the extent to which the designer can exert that control over the consumer, over the person using the technology. And it's very difficult for people to cede control, to cede creativity, really. I mean, to allow the user to be creative and take, in a sense, part of the possession of what is co-produced between, say, the designer and the consumer. An example of that where it's been very intense in game development has been transgressive play, where with almost any game, particularly the games that involve a high degree of immersion, a high degree of a sense of some kind of virtual space, players will essentially discard the design as a form, as stated as a group of rules and so on, and come up with an entirely different game. So movie making in game spaces started when players became interested in taking games that had been constructed in a certain narrative way, say a first-person shooter where your goal was to kill a certain amount of people and win the game that way, and decided instead that they would compete along the lines of how quickly they could run through the game space and get from the beginning to the end. And in doing that, in order to document that they've got through this or that game in 3 minutes and 14 seconds, or got through a level of Quake in 16 seconds, they started filming speed runs as replays of what they did, and completely took over the game space by defining their own rules, by studying the physics of that space so that they could throw grenades at their feet and jump 2 stories up to get through the level quickly, and that sort of thing. So transgressive play is a very important thing to understand, and it's a very important element in the player asserting control over their own actions in, say, a game space.
Can I just maybe follow on that and ask a question really about design education and pedagogy? Because earlier I asked a similar question about game design, player design, how does that work pedagogically? We really didn't talk about that. But what I'm curious about is one of the things that Eric talked a lot about is how this sort of speculation about what one doesn't know gets fed back into a design process, and how, in fact, failure often results in learning a lot more than had you succeeded. I mean, there's a whole kind of model of innovation built on that set of ideas. The question I have maybe for people who are running programs, and that would include Eric, me, Chris, but especially Brett, since I think he's been involved in building programs based on this kind of model. How does that work pedagogically? In other words, how do you take those kind of models that work very clearly in practice, and how do you introduce those into a design school curriculum and make those work in a way that's repeatable, in a way that's testable, in a way where the results can sort of evolve over time and become something of more than failures? In other words, how do you make a larger kind of conceptual, intellectual project, proposal for design education, when taking these observations and these facts, is actually how things happen? How do you build a curriculum like that? Brett, I'm just curious, I don't put you on the spot, but I know the DRL in many ways was based on some of this kind of thinking, especially innovation around group work, innovation around using new technologies, even gaming stuff to some extent. Maybe you could say something about that if you would.
Thanks, I will, and maybe I'll try and say it in a way that could also lead to a question for the panel. And I think it's a fantastic event and an incredibly interesting evening to try and bring together two very different, quite creative, quite experimental environments, and to imagine what happens when environments multiply with environments, and whether that becomes one big blurry soup or a series of very interesting mutations. And I think it's an incredibly demanding task to take on. And I think to paraphrase Michael's question would be, how does one design the collaboration itself? And I think there's the question of design and collaboration, but I think what he's asking effectively is how does an institution or organization, individual, try and design collaboration is some key part of the practice. And it's certainly a question we faced in creating DRL a few years ago, and I think the way we tried to answer it was really at the lowest, dumbest level possible, and to try and answer it really at the level of the routines and the activities that fill 24 hours a day. And in that way, what we tried to focus on wasn't a kind of theoretical, larger picture that we were all heading towards, but rather just to look at the habits that we all had as designers or teachers or students and ask questions about those habits. For example, the kind of habits tonight in the presentation that from a humanities lab, even when you're given a visual presentation format, it's still words that dominate as the kind of medium. From the visual side and the visual disciplines, that there's an image-based form of making an argument and a discussion, which is largely part of the convention of a discipline, but it's also an everyday habit of how it works. And I think one way, for example, to ask the question about how we collaborate is to maybe try and experiment with those assumptions. Not to try and just automatically overturn them, but to just ask the question at the simplest level. For us, for example, we just set a few very simple rules about how people fill the day. We said, look, students will never work alone, not once in their year and a half within the program. They will always be in a set of 3 or 4 or 5 people for some period of time. And without any larger demand, they will start to work through the question of what it means to think and work collaboratively. We made the same argument with the teachers and said, look, the teachers will never, as individuals, teach a studio, but they will be offered the chance to teach a studio with someone that they might or might not agree with, but through the kind of negotiation that would take place within the studio, create the circumstances where things could come up without a kind of prior determination or expectation. It might just be the sort of accidental results that sometimes come out of these sort of settings. And really it was just around those kinds of questions that we then tried to invent a pedagogy in which collaboration extended then through the full range of work. The kind of people that were brought in to teach in the lab, people other than architects like yourselves that would come from other disciplines. The requirement that, for example, all of the projects would be done over a network in real time, and every day's work would be uploaded at the end of every day, and we now have 7 or 8 years of work that each student within the lab has equal access to, that becomes the kind of raw material to experiment with. But I think those are just the kind of examples that we tried to use to try and deal with it really in the most pedestrian way possible, right? Without trying to argue for the nature of the autonomy of architecture or other disciplines, but to just set a series of conditions that then let the work itself start to arrive at the different positions. In other words, to let the work and the collaboration to try to start to set the terms for how to answer things without the prior expectation there was a definitive answer to achieve. I think what tonight's presentation shows is that there isn't a definitive kind of framework for this sort of thing, but there is the expectation, I think, in bringing together two sides of the discussion that each of those two sides will somehow reconfigure themselves. And I think that was one of the things I was struck by in tonight's presentation, was that there wasn't a presentation of how you actually work. The results of the work were made quite clear and incredibly interesting from across the full panel. And I think that the interesting thing would be to imagine that there might be much stronger connections already within what's going on than might appear in the final products. I would think game design connects to some of these projects precisely because the same software tools are being used 23 out of the 24 hours of the day. And in fact, there's a kind of correspondence that's built in that's quite separate from the disciplinary distance that's being used as a sort of assumption about how to gather the panel.
Anybody want to go at that?
I mean, just to add to that a bit, we're doing a project now in Mexico, Bahia Bolandra, which John Enright, if he's still here and still alive, the fact is that architecture moves as a consequence of a change of information which is made available. So if what's available is evolving and moving, it's conceivable the consequence of that, the making of buildings and cities, will move. And what we thought might happen is that the introduction of Michael, Jeffrey, not yet Henry, into a discussion would be not unlike a group of us sitting in a bar at 3 in the morning in Berlin and talking. And ultimately, in that discussion at 3 in the morning in that bar, the discussion is simply the discussion, and nobody is saying you're this professionally, or you have these qualifications, or you have this pedigree, or there's this history of these. It just becomes a kind of sharing of information among people who in the broadest sense, share interests. And the students then have an opportunity, and the students can testify to this or deny it, but the students then who sit in that studio and listen to the local Arab people, or to David Bergman, or to the Stanford critique, can make very particular and personal choices from a range of ideas which by intention extends past the conventional planning and design and architecture discourse. And that gives other options and presumably leads to a different formulation or a reformulation of the ideas about making things. And we'll see how that works.
Did you guys want to respond to that?
And actually, what I find really interesting tonight was the discussion about collaboration and about authorship, because architects have not really ever been just the sole author of any work. I mean, Hernan, for example, showed that as an example about how a product or a byproduct really comes out of a discussion or collaboration with a lot of people. But I think what I would like to discuss is the new idea of collaboration, which may not really be a collaboration, but maybe just a new definition of collaboration. Meaning that when you have the freedom to add on or to pick up different pieces, in other words, you, as a game designer or as an architect, you provide a framework. As a product designer, you design a telephone or a container. There will be other people, other designers who picked up from that and move on to the next. So your example, for example, which was one which is very unstructured, so that creativity abounds because anybody can add on to one idea. The idea keeps on changing and building up. But when it comes to the resolution of that one idea, then we have to move to a different model. We have to move to a model which has to be more structured because it has to then take certain kind of physicality, which kind of goes back to Eric's comment about things being more that you go from the concept, from the theory, something conceptual to something which is more formal. And I would just kind of like to re-question, put that question forward again in terms of how far do you see this new model of collaboration?
Yeah.
Yeah, that actually
actually like to jump in on both Ming's comment and Brett's comment, which really point right to the center of maybe where there are some very strong points of convergence, despite maybe surface divergences between the sort of experiment that we've been undertaking and the evolving practices on the architecture side of things. Within the Humanities Lab, this reflection on what collaboration is and how collaborations work well or not well is something that has been a kind of defining feature of the life of the lab really from the beginning, because we really honestly didn't know, when using the word laboratory to try to suggest a context where the model for the production of knowledge is a different one than the traditional humanities model. Most of our projects were, in a sense, experiments in one form or another, one modality or another of teamwork. The solutions that we've come up, I mean, very convergent with what you said, and I think Ming touched upon this as well, largely had to do with really pragmatic playing with those ground rules. I would say one of the foundational principles that has worked well for us is a kind of inverted hierarchy, where the lower you are, quote unquote, in the hierarchy, in other words, if you're an undergraduate student, you are the most rewarded. And the higher you go, all the way to principal investigators, the less rewarded you are in any kind of immediate way. And that's actually turned out to be an immensely productive structure. It's the exact opposite of what you'd expect an institution, an academic institution especially, to practice. And there's a couple of other principles I could maybe cite that would be similarly convergent with some of the ground rules you spoke about for, in a sense, creating a framework that facilitates and that allows models of teamwork to emerge then. And as it's turned out in our projects, I think we found them to be very project-driven to begin with. There isn't a single answer, in fact. There are a series of successful models, and they tend to track very closely to the kinds of questions or challenges that a project involves. So for us, this is an open question, but it's one of the central questions I think that we're interested in exploring.
I have just maybe a quick follow-up on that, and it's about, I'm going to ask it, but then I think we should see if there are questions out here. It'd be great to, because you, in fact, as Eric said, students are important, so you should have a voice in this discussion. But what I don't see, I mean, there still seems to me to be an enormous gulf between the kind of open source design methodologies and protocols that you're talking about, and the kinds of non-open source design that really happens, or that it's claimed to happen in architecture, but in fact, it really may be more open source than it's being acknowledged. I mean, so with software development, it's clear, the most innovative ways of software being developed is open source. The gaming model is a clear model, a player model. But in architecture, it's not clear to me whether that happens or whether we don't want to acknowledge that it happens. It seems to me it's a question about collaboration in these two fields that hasn't really been fully addressed. Is open source design possible in architecture? Is it desirable? Has it existed already? Should it exist?
I'm not so sure it's desirable, but in terms of this point of the collaboration, I'm not so sure it has been acknowledged, but for me, one of the critical things is, as Ming was mentioned, the notion of collaboration and interdisciplinary and all that is not really new, but I think the critical shift, it was something that was framed from a kind of more theoretical way to operate, and I think we're moving much more into kind of a production-making territory, in which all the disciplines are sharing the way how you produce and how you make them. And I think for me that is it's a critical shift, and I think if we keep progressing towards that direction, I think that for me is a fundamental difference. And when we look in the modernism that the people in the painting or architecture were sharing, like a cultural agenda, but there was a totally different way of production. Still, we are not quite there, but I think we're getting there, and I think that's going to shift the whole notion of collaboration.
That shift implies a very different model of design thinking that as far as I can see, really has not been fully addressed pedagogically by very many schools, if any, maybe only a few. But maybe I'll leave that and see if there are questions out here, or responses, or observations, or anybody have a question? This is your time to ask a question.
If you stay that late.
You stay this late, just for 5. Anybody have a question? Chris had a question.
It's more an issue of outcomes for me, in that I think for architects, and I think has been really well exposed by our 3 speakers this evening on the architecture side, architecture works towards knowing something in the way that it can be verified in a very stable outcome. So whether the glass breaks, whether the pieces move, whether the installation is actually occupiable, may start from a very broad set of speculations, but it works itself through a set of filters that ultimately is fixed in the way it realizes itself. For our colleagues on the Stanford side, knowledge is constantly fleeting. It's never able to settle sufficiently in order to be testable. And I guess the wonderful and paradoxical issue for me in terms of pedagogy is how one becomes or applies itself or is at the service of the other when they work to such different ends.
Is there a difference, though, between architectural practice and architectural design education? It seems to me that they're 2 different products. Architectural design education, it seems to me, is much more squarely addressed by the kind of issues that SHL have put on the table. And architectural design is, I think, in practice, operates much more in this goal-oriented.
What is the end of the design education, if not design? I think that there's a presumption of, or privileging of innovation and novelty here that is at odds, as Chris was getting to, with at least the historical understanding of what architecture is and does. And that I think is being confused with the whole idea of education and pedagogy. And I think that if there were to be a fruitful collaboration between the 2 sides of the table, it would have to be from the standpoint of both sides better understanding the essential, if we can even talk about essential issues these days, essential starting point of the 2 sides. I think Chris was getting at that, in that architecture is, or has at least traditionally been and will continue to be, I think, if it continues to be architecture, which itself is debatable, interested in a sort of fixity of knowledge, a question of refinement, an approach to a condition of excellence and superiority possibility, and less interested in necessarily discovering new things and all that it takes necessarily to do that. That could be a personal bias, or at least the way that I'm looking at it, but I think that it is something that has been part of the tradition of architecture. I mean, if architecture is really about this kind of enduring positioning of ourselves in the world, then that's something that will continue to exist. But that does make your earlier question about the open source become interesting, because on the one hand, it does seem that architecture and the design of architecture would resist that, but it's only if you focus on the individual architect in that process. When you think of architecture as a larger proposition, that we might say opposed to vernacular traditions, which are, say, more clearly open source, we have to see that the stuff that does bubble to the top, the stuff that we as a culture prefer over time, et cetera, is the product of communication among many architects over time. So while any individual instance might be a perfect case for the single author or a small team of authors, with that sort of tragic component that they are making this thing for a public that they will never know, which is the whole ethical side of architecture that would need to be addressed as well. Across the larger dimensions of architecture that we used to call styles and stuff, I mean, that can only be an open source kind of condition. So if we look at the different scales of it, maybe there is more connection there than we might allow ourselves just looking at the object on the table.
I think this is a response to what Wes just said. Architecture and conceivably ideas in general, architecture dates itself. It's inevitable that it does that. And books may do that, and archaeology certainly does that. So if you looked at the work or the premises of everyone who is sitting at the podium and began to take the assumptions apart, whether they have to do with the ideology of engineered design, whether they have to do with techniques, whether they have to do with a new conception about art and archaeology. Now turn the clock back 50 years and turn the clock up 50 years. So the assumption is always we're extremely hip and out there and progressive and know what's coming next. And my guess is 50 years from now, or even 10 minutes from now, depending on how quickly the discussion evolves, a lot of those assumptions inevitably will undergo a very substantial criticism. And then the work will belong inevitably to a body of ideas that will be subject to a very different kind of criticism. And it won't have to do with who's first, it'll have to do with who's durable, different, utterly different. So what tends to shine at SCI-Arc, at least historically and traditionally, to mix a metaphor, has to do with, to some extent, who's first. But over a long period of time, as the pro forma evolves, I think you can expect that a lot of who's first and who's last will disappear, the criteria will disappear, and again, the work will date itself, which is not necessarily pejorative. So it arrives and it's born in one context, but it endures or it doesn't in a very different frame of reference. And I think you have to be, students would have to be cognizant of that. So somebody once said last is first, maybe that's durable too. Thank you, Jerry Falwell.
Presentation when he showed the map, and I think if anything is going to come first, regardless of how it's going to get dated, I think the idea of the map or the plan or the diagram or the strategy or the argument, whatever you want, the thesis, it used to be called something like a thesis, I don't know if those are still around. Whatever that thing is, as a framing device, and I think that's how you described the example that you showed in your presentation, because that was so interesting, that it's evolving alongside this thing we're calling a kind of collaboration. I think that would be, I mean, if you were to collaborate on anything, let's say, in the next 10 minutes, it would be over the formation of that thing and the naming of that device, whatever it becomes, a map, a diagram. It can't be a diagram anymore, that's too 90s, but, you know, the replacement of the diagram, right, the kind of framing device that simply becomes a trigger that then starts the unfolding of where this takes each of the different sides of the disciplines involved. I think that would be the one interesting thing to speculate on at the very first, whether it's remembered or not. I think that's I thought it was quite nice in Florencia's showing of Hannes Meyer's diagram, which he does as an attack on his predecessor's diagram for all the right reasons. You know, Gropius's unwrapped architecture sits in the middle of Gropius's plan of the Bauhaus and the world unfolds around it. You know, Hannes Meyer said, no, look, he structures the organization of all of those people's activities a different way, and he does that at the beginning and then critiques it as the school evolves over 8 years. And in fact, it leads to revolution. 8 years later, the students revolt, they throw the diagram out, and the Bauhaus is required for the first time in its history to teach an architecture course. The students wanted it, not the directors. That was the one rule they had. You couldn't teach architecture. Proving that the students are always the conservative ones in any kind of discipline.
Well, on that note, somebody in the audience must have a question. Yeah.
With the crossbreeding of the disciplines and the studies, how do you see the direction of the student coming out of some program like this? What would their field be in the professional, and what direction do you see that going in?
I assume you are addressing that to the architectural educators, or
either the Humanities Lab, or if there's a collaboration.
Maybe what kind of job can you get when you when you get out of here? There's what can you do? What can you really do? I think that's a really good question because it really gets to, I mean, Hernan says he's interested in teaching techniques, but almost every discipline is interested in teaching techniques. To what end? Wes is interested, I think Wes is involved, like a number of people, in constantly being obsessed with defining what architecture is, while all the other disciplines are moving on and doing other kinds of things than what they used to do, and are taking territory that architecture maybe used to occupy, but no longer occupies because it's spinning around chasing its tail, wondering what is it. And so a question I would have just is what are you training architects to do when you're training architects to do architecture, Wes?
One of the points of the discussion of my presentation was to say that architecture, properly understood in its disciplinary guise, is a exportable phenomenon. It's a way of thinking, it's a way of structuring your thought. It is, in fact, not only, maybe it's less proper to say it's exportable than, in fact, it is being imported willy-nilly to all sorts of other fields, from fashion design to computer design to game design. And by that I don't mean the actual design of the environments, but the structure of the thinking that goes into setting up the conditions within which design can even occur, which is what you guys were more interested in. The appreciation for, and in a way maybe even that mysterious intuitive sense for how that may be advanced, when it is being done well, when it is being done poorly, how it can be done better. That's what the architecture student who has really sort of put in the time in the studio and cared about what they were doing comes away with, rather than a set of particular techniques which are themselves, in this fast-moving world, completely temporary.
But can you not say that about graphic design, about product design?
I don't think you can say.
Gaming design. I mean, what you just said. Can you not?
Well, I would be very chauvinistic about that and say you can say it, but not to the same degree. I don't think that that I don't know that much about the design education in the other fields, but I suspect that it's not invested with the same sense of ethical significance and intentionality that conditions your thinking about these issues. It's easier to innovate, of course. I mean, that's one of the things that we're struggling with.
No, it's not. It's not easy to innovate.
No, it's easy. I'm saying it's easier to innovate in the other fields, I would say.
And they're less ethical?
I would say that they work within an environment in which ethics is less of an issue. I don't know whether that makes them individually and personally less ethical or not.
But you see the weight of ethic in architecture as a positive thing? Because I despise that weight in architecture.
I see it as a necessary constituent element in what it is that architecture is trying to understand and chasing its tail through the centuries.
But what is
about
so
itself.
at the end of the day, when you go through an architectural training, or you go through the undergraduate program, or when you go through the graduate program, you get out your training, you have an architecture degree. What is it you can do that a graphic designer can't do, or that a gaming designer can't do? You still have to define what architecture is.
That's exactly, as you mentioned, it takes every generation of architects to figure that out for themselves. If I could tell you what it was, then it would be a far less interesting proposition in the first place.
It's a peculiar question, actually. I mean, do you think authorship in literature is an antique? I mean, if most people can write for USA Today or the Washington Post or online stuff, and where is this Moby Dick? Old news?
It is an antique, yeah. Huh? I think authorship
because that's really what bothers you about architecture.
I'm not bothered at all.
Sure you are.
You're bothered about me being bothered, but I'm not bothered about it.
I think your position is defensive, or you're assuming that architecture ought to be defensive because it's inadequate as it measures itself against all of what you consider to be very current in terms of technique, whether it's industrial design, filmmaking, and all of that, and that those composites of teams and knowledge making what they make is avant-garde and progressive, and the sense that seems to belong almost inevitably to architecture, which has to do with authorship, is antiquated. I think that's really what you're saying. And antiquated means passé in terms of conceding the prospect of what is new or inventive to a different group of people. But the criteria is different.
I would say
it can be different.
I would say that
I mean, I think we could make an argument that we could make.
But there is something fair in that question that we're not answering. It's like if you ask a car designer, what do you do? I do cars. We ask architects, what do you do? And we always, we do buildings. I mean, we should answer that. We design
That is
buildings.
the answer.
Yeah, but we never answer that. We always,
That is the answer. But the difference is, this is not.
None of us, we say that.
Yeah, nobody said that yet.
But I mean, if Le Corbusier came along in 1925
so much more than that.
And said,
yes.
I've made as many buildings as a lot of the architects who taught at the school in history.
Can I
That's true.
None.
Slightly question which I thought of a lot during this very stimulating set of presentations, and it has to do with, and Wes kind of brought up that the idea that every technical advance quickly becomes waste, quickly becomes obsolete. And I was wondering if people on the panel thought that there could be like, kind of Catholic culture of ceaseless obsolescence, whether the usage of an outmoded and obsolete technique would have a quick function.
Well, anything that is different
I
can.
should just say I asked that question because this is a really strong preoccupation in the visual arts right now. I mean, this idea, Adorno is someone who formulated it, but it's something that in the last couple of decades, particularly in a negotiation with digital media and visual arts, this question has come about the outmoded and the notion of the outmoded as a side of resistance, however problematic the notion of resistance is, understandable. But in any case, that idea that an outmoded media, like making, like Alex Kulla's work, making photographs rather than using digital or something like, this kind of the usage of media that are no longer considered to be part of the kind of waste of our culture. So I just wondered if people had
I think that's actually happening in the school already. As the convention becomes digital, there are those students who hold out for hand drawing and consider that to be a rebellious act.
Do you think it is? Do you think it is?
Well, I have to say, I would question.
Pennsylvania, they're Amish. I mean, they still ride horses and all that.
But see, I would question in this particular discussion the definition and privileging that's implied of this idea of outmoded. I think the idea of outmoded can only be understood in relation to what the result is, the intention. And I think that in architecture, at least, as Michael has so humorously told us, in the end, what we do is we design buildings. And if we understand that all of the techniques are related ultimately to the production of the best, well, see, now that's even a question of debate here, because whereas I would assume that the point of the education is to make the students better or to do the best work, in fact, the presumption today is that it is to make them to do the most innovative or different or newest work. And that's very different often. Sometimes they're the same thing. But it's from that generalized privileging of the new over the good, even, that I think that even a notion of the outmoded as being critical, potentially critical, to try to recuperate for something that otherwise in society is, in a society that privileges innovation and novelty over excellence or goodness, is itself a debatable question, that privileging. So, but I think that in fact, to go back to the very beginning, it does happen in architecture. I mean, architects are used to still thinking critically. They look around, seeing what is the convention in the school, which is not necessarily what's always the case out in the world, and reacting to that, positioning themselves individually.
You know, there's a fascinating television advertisement. Maybe you've seen it. The man and woman sit in an airport lounge, and the woman starts talking about accounting software.
I haven't seen it.
Well, maybe. There's still hope that you'll miss it. And she says to the guy, as they're waiting for the plane, which is of course late, she says to the guy, "Doesn't your company have da-da-da-da-da?" And he's chagrined and embarrassed and under the table and doesn't want to say that in fact he's not the latest and the newest and the hippest, because there's nothing in him that engenders the capacity to resist whatever is continuing to be sold and promoted. So either in fashion or in cell phones or in films, if there isn't anything in Jung's term introverted, internal to the person that says, I can look at something in a critical way. I'll buy the software, I won't. I'll use it, I don't want it. I prefer it, I'll avoid it. One of the reasons I used very, very old images, 15th century, is not an accident, because what interested me in that discussion was whether there was any longevity to any of to Bruegel and blind people and Seurat and all of these things that in your terms, in terms that, not your terms, but they say or it is said, that those ideas are antiques in a way. I think they're actually not, and I think it would be my view as an aspiration that you could create a student mind that had enormous capacities to draw, to build models, to know the history, the pedigree, and to think in what I would call a historical way, meaning the record of the discipline in the world. And I think that would be important. And simultaneously to create a tension in that student, a suspicion, an intellectual suspicion of ideologies that now we can see over long distances and everywhere in the world come and go, so that simply attaching yourself or oneself to a particular pro forma is not necessarily the way to be a critical intellectual. And architecture has that as a fundamental aspect. So it's a way of thinking about living. And I think that's what the Stanford Humanities Lab brings to the table, thinking about living. And it does it in a way which is completely outside the formulation of the traditional architecture pedigree. That's why the discussion's important. You don't want ideologues and you don't want party signees. You don't want that. So outmoded may not be outmoded. And the guy who doesn't have the software should say, yeah, I take out an abacus, and that's how I figure it out.
Let me just say a few things to try and give our humanities perspective back to this. When is a building not a building? You seem very hung up on this notion that the building is this structure that you build and you've designed and there it is. But buildings change, and you're not asking how people use buildings and what they're doing with them, and the fact that that use actually constitutes that structure, and the structure has a history. And wasn't it, Toomey who said, well, yes, you can sing in the bath. There are all sorts of things you can do in a building which aren't necessarily part of your intentional design. And to what extent does intentionality actually constitute the design? Not necessarily at all. One of the things that certainly we're very, very concerned about in our kind of interdisciplinary thing, if that's it, is to say that, well, the notion that we have of the thing, of the product, of the structure, of the architecture is not necessarily best conceived as a self-contained entity. That is a thing with attributes that you can define, properties that you can work upon. But rather, it is a node in a set of connections of relational things, forces, and whatever, which is captured in that notion of heterogeneous engineering that I mentioned earlier, which comes out of a sociology, history of technology that has attempted to understand what it is that makes a building, or what makes an invention an invention. And so Edison's electric light bulb, to understand it, it's best actually to see it not as a device, an electric light bulb, at all. Thomas Hughes's history of the light bulb shows beautifully that the invention of the light bulb is just so much more than simply the device itself. It's about networking, it's about building societies. You're building structures, in that sense, societies. So break down the boundaries, and I think there is a lot more in common. In fact, than this notion that buildings are fixed and you can test them. Well, you know, I can give you some fabulous tests on the physicality and materiality of a book. It's in a library, it has a form, and it was produced by a series of processes that are involved in academic production. And then as to the business of moding and outmoding and time, temporality, absolutely. These are, of course I'm going to say they're archaeological things, but if you just step back a little bit and say, well, is it moded, outmoded? That's not so much the issue. The issue is that what we're talking about are relationships to the temporality of buildings and things and people. And that we can sometimes tactically see when, you know, celebrating the history of something and, you know, its tradition and that being a model or a paradigm for action practice is what is appropriate or not. That, though, is an ethical, political, located issue. What is at stake, though, are a whole series of factors in those political debates over your practice, who you are, what you're doing, for whom you are acting as a professional or as a community member, or as a stakeholder, or as an authority, or as an agent. So immediately, your device, I would suggest, has to be elided, your structure has to be elided into issues of time, temporality, which immediately implicates also ethics and politics, and agency, and then also, at the bottom end of it, I suppose, is historicity, our sense of belonging in history, who we are, what impact we are having, and how we're helping, or not, other people to realize and see all of that. And that, I would say, is Eric's critical side to it, giving people the tools to share this with us, that is, these debates, these processes, these things which aren't fixed, but to be shared.
I hate to do this. It's 10 o'clock. We've been at this for 3 hours. It's been really incredible. That should be the last comment on the beginning of a conversation that hopefully is going to lead us in collaborations between SHL and SCI-Arc over time. I want to thank everybody from Stanford who came down today. It was really a terrific conversation. Presenters as well, the faculty of the school, especially the students, and especially Florencia, who did facilitate. I think that's it. I think we'll have it, at some point we'll have all this on the video. And as I said, this is the beginning of a collaboration. This is the phase 1. We'll go from here. Thanks, everybody.